Wiretapping, anxious breakdowns, crying senators, and a bullet. These and more all happened in the 1972 presidential elections, one of the most chaotic and toxic elections we've ever seen. That is, until 4 years later when it was arguably topped in chaos and toxicity, a trend we really haven't seen stop till today. You see, there were multiple key players in this election that worked to undo a lot of what was considered decent in electoral politics. First and foremost was that of the Nixon campaign. In order to look at the oddities of the Nixon campaign, it's important to also look at the oddities of Nixon. He lived a very crazy life, but I used the Richard Nixon Library's biography, President Nixon, The Life, to get a solid overview over his early years. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in the township of Yorba Linda, California. Nixon grew up poor. He lived in a house built by his father, Francis Nixon, on his failing lemon ranch. He was raised a member of the Quaker faith, which meant he had to do a lot of things. He was homeschooled, he was given restrictions on alcohol, he was given restrictions on dancing and swearing, too. Despite being offered a scholarship to Harvard, he had to stay local to take care of his brother, and so he attended local Whittier College instead. After graduating summa cum laude from Whittier, he was accepted at the Duke School of Law on a full ride. After a short career as a lawyer, Nixon enlisted in the Navy, although he could have legally been exempt from the draft due to his Quaker faith. During his time at Duke in the Navy, Nixon met a group of people whom he would resent for the rest of his life, the Ivy League elites. People were given acceptances to elite schools and found elite jobs with elite salaries, and it wasn't because of what they did, but it was because of who their families were. Nixon was relieved from active duty in 1946 and would soon after run for Congress in California's 12th District off of his own poker winnings. Nixon won the race handily. He would serve as a congressman until 1953, making his fame as a staunch conservative and for his working with Joseph McCarthy to fight communism internally and externally. Nixon would eventually join Dwight D. Eisenhower's campaign as the vice presidential nominee. The Eisenhower ticket would eventually win big in 1952 and again in 1956, with Nixon being the heir apparent to the presidency for the 1960 election. However, his challenger, John F. Kennedy, would continue to rise in the polls and make the election closer and closer. By November, the two would be neck and neck in the polls, and everyone was bracing for one of the closest elections in history. This would end up being the case, where Kennedy would win the Electoral College by a tipping point of 0.5%. Nixon was furious. In 1962, Nixon would try his hand for California governor. He would end up losing this race, largely because people felt as if he saw the governorship more as a stepping stool to becoming president than anything else. After his defeat, he would famously go on the air saying,
"You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference."
And that was it. Nixon was done with public office. That was until 6 years later, where he would once again run for public office. After spending the last few years building up his reputation as a statesman, Nixon saw the political capital he built turn into success as he defeated multiple big names like Romney, Rockefeller, and Reagan with relative ease in the primary. Reflective of the hate he had for the Northeast establishment of the country, he campaigned off the idea that there was some type of silent majority being underrepresented by the elite. He claimed the recent spike in crime was because the Democrats were too soft on criminals, and he said the Democrats were similarly too soft on the Soviets, too, letting them get the upper hand in defense capabilities. He also promised to end the war in Vietnam, offering peace with honor, which became a trademark of his campaign. In the Democratic primary, Nixon was watching the worst-case scenario come to fruition, though. New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy was on his way to become the nominee for the Democrats, polling well against Nixon, too. This furthered Nixon's irrational fear of Kennedy's. However, Kennedy would be assassinated during the California primary, leaving a gaping hole at the top of the Democratic primary. After a chaotic Democratic National Convention that led to riots across the streets of Chicago, Vice President Hubert Humphrey was picked as the new Democratic nominee, a lamb to the slaughter, many thought. After the DNC, Nixon was polled with as high of a 16% lead over Humphrey. However, Humphrey continued to narrow the gap between him and Nixon. By October, President Lyndon Johnson began preparing a plan to negotiate a bombing halt in Vietnam with the South Vietnamese in order to help his Vice President Hubert Humphrey's campaign. Nixon's camp got word of this, and Nixon made a choice that would be extremely important for his future. He interfered. The administration worked to sabotage these negotiations by using a plant named Anna Chenault to delay the resolution until after the election. This decision paid off for Nixon, helping him beat Humphrey in a tight race. Nixon clearly learned something here. In a world where everyone is plotting against you, you either lose or plot back. At this point, Nixon is paranoid of everything and everyone. Nixon was ready to use any means necessary to win re-election, and so he began to do so. The year is 1971. The Nixon administration hasn't gone without its controversies, but by and large it's been pretty successful so far. This is marked by Nixon being up from 10 to 15% in approval ratings and leading most of his Democratic opponents in the polls. However, this isn't enough for Nixon. He's seen what leading in early polls gets you, and he is not satisfied. Now, let's stop for a second. At this point, you should probably meet some of the Democrats that Nixon ran against before we go any further. First is South Dakota Senator George McGovern. McGovern represented the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and had a long list of bold policies. He argued for an immediate end of the Vietnam War, a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens, and universal access to health insurance. McGovern had built a lot of political connections in the past decade of his service in the Senate, but nobody really considered him a serious contender for the nomination. Edmund Muskie was a senator from Maine and the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats in 1968. Muskie was a pretty staunch liberal. He also spoke out against the war, and he argued for economic reforms to maintain equal opportunity and reform the tax system. Muskie was polling the highest of the candidates against Nixon, and was seen as a talented speaker and campaigner. If you know the name George Wallace, it's probably because of this quote from his 1963 inauguration address.
Say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Yeah, to put it lightly, this quote did not hold up well at all, but you know who agreed with that statement too? Surprisingly enough, George Wallace himself. Since that campaign 4 years ago, Wallace had actually come around on civil rights, apparently. He did still come out against racialized busing, the major civil rights issue of the day, but he stood with the majority of America on this. Wallace instead focused on a strongly populist rhetoric, appealing to the fears of workers who felt like the world around them was changing into one unfamiliar and hostile to them. Former Vice President Hubert Humphrey was a pretty serious contender for the nomination. He was the party's nominee in 1968 and ran a tough fight versus Nixon. He was one of the biggest names in the party and maybe the most respected liberal in America. He called for pulling troops out of Vietnam and stimulating the slowing economy, which really failed to differentiate him from a lot of his competitors, namely Muskie, but might be the right decision considering his name recognition. There were many other big names in these primaries. It's one of the most star-studded in history. But for the sake of time, the ones you need to remember are McGovern, Muskie, Wallace, and Humphrey. Now, let's get back to the timeline. In order to gather a timeline of the Democratic primary and general election, I used CQ Press's Chronology of Political Events, January 1971 to November 1972, and CQ Almanac 1972. On February 24, 1972, the Manchester Union Leader, a conservative newspaper in New Hampshire, published an editorial titled Senator Muskie Insults Franco-Americans. Inside was a letter sent to them from a law student named Paul Morrison, where, in chicken-scratch writing, he recounted Muskie and a staffer being asked how they could understand the struggles of black Americans when his home state of Maine had such a small black population. Morrison recalled that the staffer said, "No blacks, but we have Canucks." When asked what he meant by that, Muskie replied with, "Come to New England and see." On top of the insensitive comment, the usage of the term Canuck was noted, as it was seen at the time as a derogatory term for French Canadians, although it's since been reclaimed to more of an affectionate connotation. This spelled disaster for the Muskie campaign, as the upcoming primary in New Hampshire had a rather large French Canadian voter base. The next day, the Union Leader released another editorial, this time about Muskie's wife. They labeled her uncouth, saying that she made jokes that weren't proper for a woman at the time. This attack on his wife set Muskie over the top. The following day, he made a public speech outside of the Union Leader's office, outright denying the accusations towards his wife and calling the author of the editorials, William Loeb III, a liar. However, the speech ended up hurting Muskie the most out of the incidents, as many newspapers covering the speech reported that Muskie apparently broke into tears throughout the speech. It's hard to say if he actually did break down, though. Muskie's defense was that his face was wet from snow blowing in, and the cracks were coming from anger rather than sadness. Honestly, from the videos you can find, this does track. It didn't manage, though, to save his reputation. The damage had been done, and Muskie had just lost all the momentum that he had just days prior. Later, it would be revealed, though, that the author of the Canuck letter, Paul Morrison, didn't exist. That's right. Rather, he and the Canuck letter itself were made up by Nixon's committee to re-elect the president to ensure that he wouldn't get the nomination. This fact would come out years later, far too late to save Muskie's reputation. Muskie would still win the New Hampshire primary with 46% of the vote, but this is nowhere near how much was anticipated. McGovern ended up carrying 37% of the vote as well, a massive overperformance and a statement win that gave his campaign all of the momentum that Muskie had just lost. Later, on April 4th, McGovern unexpectedly won the Wisconsin primary. This upset even further boosted his chances of winning, and he was now considered a pretty serious candidate for the nomination. My dad also turned 6 that day, so happy birthday, Dad. Former Muskie supporters continued to leave after his fourth-place finish in Wisconsin, and as shown by his victory in Pennsylvania, Hubert Humphrey seemed to become the front-runner out of the Liberals. At this point, it looked like the nomination would be between Wallace, McGovern, or Humphrey. Meanwhile, Wallace was easily carrying primaries across the South and was hoping to win big in the states of Michigan and Maryland. However, the day before these primaries, Wallace would be shot 4 times by a man named Arthur Bremer, which would paralyze Wallace for the rest of his life and effectively end his campaign. On June 17th, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Convention's headquarters in the Watergate Hotel and were charged with attempted burglary. One of the men, James W. McCord Jr., was on the payroll of Nixon and the RNC as their security coordinator. It would later come out that this was another action of Nixon's committee to re-elect the president. On June 6, McGovern won the deeply important California primary. This mattered so much because not only did California's 271 delegates give it the second most in the country, but the state elected to have a winner-take-all system, giving all 271 to McGovern. The Humphrey campaign took this decision to court, arguing that it wasn't fair, but the decision was upheld, and McGovern took a commanding lead over Humphrey in the delegate count, killing his hopes of becoming the nominee. He would shortly drop out of the race. On June 12th, McGovern was officially named the nominee by the Democratic National Convention. So a lot of stuff's just happened. Let's take some time to think about the most impactful points, starting with the elephant in the room. George McGovern has just pulled off one of the greatest upsets in history, going from a 3% voter intention before the primaries to handily winning the election by the DNC. How did this happen? To answer this question, I looked at Jamie Sanchez's Revisiting McGovern-Fraser, Party Nationalization and the Rhetoric of Reform. This journal looked at some of the ways that McGovern exploited the new Democratic primary system to his favor. What did he do, though? Well, first of all, McGovern's decision to declare for the nomination as early as possible, becoming the most early announcement since Andrew Jackson's in 1825. This gave him weeks' worth of a head start in the publicity department. He also campaigned extremely hard in primaries to ensure his campaign could build momentum early. He masterfully put all eyes on him, which really wasn't a given at the start of the election. He also essentially created the textbook for a grassroots campaign. After the disastrous Democratic National Convention of 1968, the party had finally had a catalyst to reform many of their broken systems. The most impactful part of these reforms, though, were on the primary process. Backdoors deals were far less important, and state politicians, who were typically very corrupt, were essentially stripped of power in the nomination system. He campaigned especially hard in states with caucuses to drive turnout, which matters especially more in the caucus system, and in states with winner-take-all systems like California. In general, McGovern understood this new primary system better than anyone else and successfully managed to exploit it to his favor. I wonder why that was. McGovern now faced a tough choice. He needed to find a vice president. First, he looked at Ted Kennedy, brother of RFK and JFK, and still probably the face of the party, but he declined. His next thought, after months of brutal party infighting, he could make some concessions to the moderate wing. He offered it to Humphrey, who declined. Musty declined too, as did McGovern's colleagues in the Senate, Abraham Ribicoff, Frank Church, and Gaylord Nelson. McGovern quickly realized that most high-profile Democrats would be uneasy of their odds about winning with him. By day 2, McGovern found young Senator Thomas Eagleton and added him to the short list after showing some interest. On day 3, McGovern asked Kennedy if there was any chance he'd change his mind, to which Kennedy replied with a strong no. McGovern went on and picked Eagleton without much of a background check. Moderates were still a bit sore over McGovern winning. For instance, Philadelphia Mayor Frank Rizzo said that he would do everything in his power to bring about the defeat of McGovern. More than a little sore, I guess. Now, this was already bad news for McGovern, but the worst was yet to come. After McGovern's frantic selection of Eagleton as his vice president, one done without any real background checks or guardrails, news quickly broke of Eagleton's past. There was hospitalizations for nervous exhaustion happening 3 times over the past 12 years. McGovern originally stood with his running mate, claiming he was with him 1,000%, but negative attention from the public and McGovern camp themselves, sending mixed messages, made it obvious that Eagleton didn't stand much of a chance to stay on the ticket until November. Eagleton was eventually persuaded to drop out, and Sergeant Shriver, Ted Kennedy's brother-in-law, became the nominee for vice president. Messaging throughout the campaign followed a pretty simple line: Nixon would brutally attack and McGovern would be forced to defend. This worked brilliantly for him, as McGovern was always forced to focus on maintaining his own voters rather than appealing to swing voters, a strategy that really didn't work out for him. On November 7, 1972, Richard Nixon handily won re-election. He won 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17, the last electoral vote going to libertarian activist John Hospers, and Nixon carried over 60% of the popular vote to McGovern's 37.5%, the largest popular vote victory for a Republican in history. However, in the following years, many of Nixon's dirty tricks would come to light. It started with the immediate backlash to the Watergate break-in, though burglars were arrested in the hotel, and some of the burglars were quickly lined with Nixon indirectly. The negative press keeps growing. More aides are fired. Meanwhile, Nixon famously tells the public he isn't a crook. As pressure begins to build and impeachment looms for Nixon, he does eventually resign from office in a disgrace. The public is enraged. So what if this didn't happen? What if Nixon played fair, and what if scandals didn't hit the White House? To answer this question, I looked at the National Constitution Center staff's The Legacy of Watergate, 5 Ways Life Changed After the Scandal. This is a pretty complicated question. On one hand, many themes in the modern U.S. can be directly related to Watergate, most notably a much larger distaste towards career politicians and lack of trust in the government. It's hard to overstate how much government trust was splintered for the public after Watergate. Government approval polls from the 1960s to post-Watergate fell by around 50%, going from around 75 to 25% approval. With that being said, Watergate is a lot more powerfully viewed as an inflection point. This short moment in American history completely reshaped our political environment. It's hard envisioning a world without Watergate where Jimmy Carter becomes president, for example. His entire thing was government honesty, and without Watergate, this doesn't really matter as much. This probably means that Ted Kennedy would run for office at some point and probably win, too. The biggest thing stopping him from an eventual run was Carter taking over as the face of the party, pushing him out of the spotlight. The Reagan Revolution was still probably unavoidable, but it could have come at a different time, which could mean a different thing for the Republican Party. If he ran in 1976, he probably would have been blamed for the economy, and the Reagan Revolution could have ended within 4 years. I also have a hard time seeing someone like Trump getting elected. He ran off the ideas that there was rampant corruption in the system that needed to be drained, and again, that appeal really isn't there anymore. This is a really tough question, though, one that doesn't really have any final answer. How does Nixon staying in office affect America or even the world? Watergate did directly affect the way foreign countries view us, too. If Nixon finishes his term without scandals, the U.S. likely enters the next few years with a very different political culture, more trusting and less cynical. These changes are a lot more dramatic than the scandal itself, and thinking about those become a lot more powerful.